Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. The Cold War was a period of heightened tension between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union, lasting almost the whole second half of the 20th century. It's one for the history books, but recent U.S. spat with partners over trade and matters of so-called national security have led many to think of a return of the Iron Curtain. Before we begin our discussion about that important trend, let's take a look at this first.
Although fictional, James Bond, also known as 007, have become synonymous with spy thriller action in internationally successful Cold War-themed films. Espionage, the threat of a nuclear war, arms race, and mutual deterrence through fear of retaliation are major elements of the decades-long geopolitical divide. The tension was between the powers of the Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc, mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War captured the imagination of popular culture. The vestiges of the Cold War, with the world's superpower in constant conflict with rivals, may have spurred recent geopolitical shifts. Trade wars over tariffs are just the beginning. It's been more than a month since the U.S. and China levied tit-for-tat tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods. New U.S. tariffs on another $16 billion are set to take effect in 2 weeks, prompting China to retaliate in kind.
The U.S. is provoking this trade war, and we do not wish to fight. But in order to safeguard the interests of the country and the people, we have to fight if necessary.
Washington said it will impose fresh sanctions on Russia by the end of August for allegedly using a nerve gas on a former Russian agent and his daughter in Britain in March. The sanctions target exports of equipment which Russia considered sensitive to national security.
Russia has warned multiple times that using force and using ultimatums when talking with us is futile. Russia is going to develop a response to this very hostile step on the part of Washington.
The first round of new U.S. sanctions against Iran went into effect on Tuesday, since President Trump withdrew from the multi-party nuclear agreement earlier this year. He warned that anyone who does business with Iran will not be able to do business with the U.S.
Trump and his government are the ones who have rejected negotiations and have turned their back on diplomacy. What he is doing is against the Iranian nation and against the national interest of Iran. Iran is ready for diplomacy if there's honesty in the process.
Are those the harbinger of a new Cold War?
So, are the trade wars the U.S. has started with its trading partners around the world only the prelude to a new kind of Cold War? That is a big question. However, we have some experts help us to sharpen the opinions. Let's turn to our panelists. Yang Xiyu, a senior research fellow of the China Institute of International Studies. In Philadelphia, the United States, we invited Geoffrey Garrett, the dean of the Wharton School, who's also a Reliance professor of management and private enterprise. Gentlemen, I want to welcome to both of you to our program. First of all, Professor, let me ask you, Professor Garrett, about whether it is a new kind of trade war or not. What do you think is the barometer that we could rely on?
Well, I think when it comes to this topic, we certainly have the first level, which is a concern in the U.S. that's been there for a very long time, that there's an asymmetry in U.S.-China trade. Broadly speaking, the U.S. market is more open to Chinese products than the Chinese market is to American. That's the baseline that's been there for a long time. I think what the Trump administration has added to the equation is the notion that the whole Chinese economy in some sense is unfair, with a real focus on the Made in China 2025 program, and that program, designed to make China a global leader in innovative industry like AI, all the tech sectors, then leads to this concern that technology can be used for national security purposes. So it's certainly not a new Cold War yet, But I think that the trajectory of change in the Trump policy is really quite extreme, because the U.S. government for a long time just said more interactions with China economically are in the interests of both countries. They saw win-win. Trump tends to see win-lose.
Mr. Yang, what about that mentality? That seems to be what the Cold War was all about, isn't it? It's about win-lose. It's about using threats, using propaganda, using all kinds of political tools, just one step short of starting a so-called military war. That was what it's all about during the Cold War. Mr. Yang, what about your thoughts of what is going on right now? Is the trade war the prelude to a new kind of Cold War?
Yeah, it's a really critical question facing, not only facing Chinese people, but facing Chinese top leaders. Now, not only the trade war or trade tensions at the crossroads either go to the win-win result or win-lose result, and also in the general bilateral relation is also at the crossroads, either go into the Cold War or no Cold War, because the trade issue has been strategized by the United States. Just then, Professor Garrett mentioned the Chinese program 2025. In nature, this program is an industrial policy, but for American observation, that's really a strategy. If that is a strategy, U.S. will certainly have an anti-strategy to contain China, and China will certainly have a reaction. So such a negative interaction will lead the bilateral issue into Cold War mode.
Professor Gary, if I could push a little bit further about what has been discussed, if you look at the impact, the current tariffs and the rounds of tit-for-tat going on between China and the United States, this is very much likely to have an influence on the kinds of export that the two countries can work on together. It's also going to have an impact on the merger and acquisition deals that could ever be there between these two countries. It is also going to have an impact on the technological transfer, technological deals between the two countries. So you have a pretty much supply chain, innovation chain rather, between the two countries likely to be blocked, at least for the time being. Who knows how long it will last? So, Professor Garrett, is this a dangerous trend that we are seeing about trade and also about bilateral relations?
Yeah, so I think you've highlighted you've made a key observation, which is that, you know, in Trump's world, in the world of politics in the U.S.-China relationship is all about trade. You know, something is made in the U.S., sold in China, made in China, sold in the U.S. As you pointed out, we actually live in a world of global supply chains. So many American products are assembled in China, final assembly in China, then sold back to the U.S. and sold to the global market. The example I always use is Apple Computer. You know, Apple is just valued at $1 trillion. It's an iconic American company, but every Apple device, as you know, is assembled in China by Foxconn. Now, a lot of those products are sold back to the U.S. That shows up as an import to the U.S. That makes no sense. What we haven't, I think, appreciated enough in America is how important the Chinese market has become to Apple. And it's not only Apple. Think of another American iconic company, General Motors. General Motors sells more vehicles in China than it does in the U.S. The problem for Trump is that those cars aren't made in Detroit, they're made in Pudong. So the global economy, the realities of the global economy today and the connections between the US and China are far different from the world of political rhetoric that we see in this win-loss trade war rhetoric that the US is espousing today.
Professor Garrett, if further building on what you just said, you see this trade dispute. The U.S. side, the Trump administration, I mean, try to resort to some of the laws, the trade laws, that were adopted during the Cold War era, back to the 1970s. For example, 301 or 232. Many of those are very old practices, and they were relevant during the Cold War era. there is also the concern, Professor Garrett, that those old tools being used to fix the new problem, whether that will lead us to a further going down the path of possible Cold War, new Cold War. Professor Garrett.
Yeah, so I think this is also a very important point. Most countries have always had national security exclusions to trade. So if something is a very sensitive military technology, countries have had the ability to say, listen, normal free trade rules won't apply. I think you're absolutely right to say that in the now almost 30 years since the end of the Cold War, those national security barriers to trade have been reduced. They haven't been used very much. So it is striking that the Trump administration has been willing to use national security provisions as a way to impose tariffs on Chinese products. The other thing that I think is distinctive about what the Trump administration is doing is it's using American trade law rather than provisions of the World Trade Organization to prosecute its grievances with China. And I think that China very reasonably could say, listen, a dispute between the US and China should be arbitrated by the World Trade Organization, not in an American domestic environment. But the US has often done this. When it comes to trade disputes, they tend to want to use domestic legislation rather than WTO.
Right. Having said that, though, Mr. Yang from China, you see some of the deals, well-known deals, has been blocked, or well-known Chinese companies running into huge problem in the United States as a result of the trade war. ZTE is one thing, highly penalized money-wise, revoke of the operating license temporarily at least, and prohibiting from selling products to the American market, and certainly provide equipment to the American companies. You see almost similar with Huawei. You also see Alibaba, which is a public trading private company, being blocked from doing business with MoneyGram, acquiring MoneyGram in the United States. So you see these one after another cases. This is not just about Chinese companies. It could come to any company in any country if this way of doing things with the Trump administration continues. So Mr. Yang, once again, my question, is this the prelude when it comes to trade now, but really eventually of something like a new Cold War starting with trade?
I think now U.S. Trump administration is focusing on high-tech Chinese companies running business or plan to run business in China, in the United States, simply because of the so-called national security. In fact, the disputes between China and the U.S. for China, it's disputes on rules, but for the United States, it's a dispute for their national security. I freshly remember during the BIT bilateral negotiation between U.S. and China, and Chinese delegation complained and argued and asked American delegation, say, just give us a red line, and then we will tell all Chinese companies don't touch the red line. But the answer from the U.S. side is no, it will be case by case. So no transparency, no definite rules, just by case. So basically, I think the U.S. side has been politicalized and strategized Chinese business and investment in with the United States. If that trend becomes a constant policy, I'm afraid that the trend of the bilateral relation will inevitably go into Cold War.
We are not being nationalistic here. What we are talking about is a trend that the world is observing very closely, and what it might mean for all of us, the individuals, business communities, and also countries as well. You're watching World Insight with me. The two gentlemen, Mr. Yang, Mr. Garrett, stay with us, and we will be back after this. Watching World Insight, I'm Tian Wei. A new Cold War question mark. That's what we are talking about and discussing today. We have a studio in Beijing, Mr. Yang Xiyu once again, and also from Philadelphia, Dean Geoffrey Garrett. Meanwhile, we're joined in London by Alexander Nekrasov, who is a former advisor to the Kremlin. Also in Washington, D.C., we invited John Citilis, who is a global risk analyst at the Trilogy Advisors. Welcome to all of you. I want to invite your opinion as well, John. I mean, if you listened earlier to our conversation between the other two gentlemen, Mr. Yang and Professor Garrett, you certainly noticed that the word Cold War has been pretty much discussed. John, you remember very well from Nixon's time on to Bill Clinton and even to George W. Bush, and certainly to some years Obama administration, engagement with China is one of the most important things. And that has guaranteed the two countries did not run into a Cold War since the 1970s. But the question is the trend that is going on right now really driving the two countries in much faster speed to something like a new Cold War? John.
Well, first of all, let's be clear that there continues to be very high-level engagement between the United States and China on a whole range of critical issues. And if nothing else, the effort to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula is foremost among them. And also to try to find a diplomatic, peaceful solution to territorial expansion by China in the South China Sea. But I'm somewhat skeptical of the phrase Cold War because there's really no military aspect to the competition between the United States and China right now. It could develop in the years down the road, but the U.S. military is still the dominant military around the world, and the Cold War dates back to the U.S.-Soviet competition that played out not so much on the economic sphere because the Soviet Union had no economy to speak of, but politically and militarily. This is political and economic competition on a strategic level between the U.S. and China. And so I'm very wary of the phrase Cold War, but it could go down that path depending on the direction the countries take in the next 5 to 15 years.
Mr. Yang, you want to respond to your American colleague, what he just said. And meanwhile, of course, we are not talking about the traditional Cold War, which is between China and the former between the United States and the former Soviet Union. At that time, former Soviet Union's economy is not globalized at all, and therefore there's no trade war between the two countries. And yet we are talking about a new trend, whether it started from trade and eventually lead to other places, Mr. Yang.
Well, let me put it this way. Firstly, if you ask the question whether or not the Moscow and Washington at that time wanted or planned to pull the relation into Cold War, the answer was clearly no. And now, if you ask whether or not President Xi or President Trump want or plan to pull the bilateral into Cold War, no. But why more people talk about that? Simply because misunderstandings, miscalculations, and misinteractions build up. Now that is the trend. That's why the worrisome is increasing. Not only the trade war, but also, for example, cooperation on North Korea. Originally, that was a positive pillar for the bilateral. Thanks to the cooperation on South China Sea stabilities and denuclearization on Peninsula, currently the bilateral relationship is stable, but the mutual suspicions are increasing.
Right.
Just 2 days ago, I attended a bilateral closed-door meeting between U.S. and China. Ironically, Chinese began to suspicious about U.S. true intention of the denuclearization.
Right.
China, some Chinese worried that U.S. will allow North Korea to be nuclearized.
So your point is, Mr. Yang, what exactly is your point?
Well, I think the mutual suspicions at the strategic level is increasing. That will lead the bilateral relation into the wrong direction. That direction doesn't planned and wanted by both of the capitals.
Right. Professor Garrett, even though you're a professor on the management and economic issues, but I would also like to go to you about that because trade is a very important issue here. In the U.S. strategic paper that were put out at the end of last year, China is being termed as, quote, revisionist power, which it meant, as the document indicated, China is here to challenge the US-led international system. But ironically, it is the United States that tries to withdraw from the current, what they consider as the US-led international system. For example, WTO, for example, TPP, and some of the other issues. So, Professor Gary, putting a name out there by the United States already, does it already indicate to the other countries, China particularly, of what Washington wants to do? I mean, just fairly from an academic perspective from you, sir.
Yeah, so look, I think again we have an escalation in the Trump administration's thinking, and let me describe it like this.
All right.
So they say, listen, we've been losing on trade with China, but that's not the most important thing. We also think that the entire Chinese model of development, let's call it industrial policy, is unfair. And because China is now so focused on cutting-edge technology, that's not only an economic threat to the US, it's potentially a national security threat. Then the last element is the one that you added. They also have said in the national security strategy that China is a revisionist power that wants to change the world order. So what I would say about that is that there are themes that have been in the US before, but on most dimensions, Trump has just turned up the dial to a very high level, to a point where we don't focus on win-win, we focus on win-loss. And I think that's the wrong trajectory. The question is this just a temporary bargaining move by the US, or is it a longer change in strategic orientation? I don't think we know the answer to that question yet.
Not yet, sir. Mr. Stylianides, therefore I go to you. You do hear not only strategic terms coming from the current administration about how they see China, particularly in the near future, but you also hear, for example, from the recent Trump meets the business leader meeting, that President Trump, unfortunately, as the President of the United States, termed, quote, almost every Chinese student in the United States is a spy, end of quote. That is unfortunate, I have to say, as a president to say something like that. But it does add to the so-called propaganda that is going on in some countries about the potential of the two countries' relations. So, Mr. Stylianides, of course, Washington is not represented by Trump alone. But the question is, what about that trend? How dangerous, and how can we do to prevent it from further escalation? Mr. Stylianides.
President Trump's comments obviously reflect his own personal observations culled over the decades, but I do believe there's a larger and growing skepticism among Washington institutions, many lawmakers, many heads of policy institutes, and other opinion leaders. There's a growing level of unease about the U.S.-China relationship and the direction in which China may be headed. And I think much of this plays out in the context of, as was mentioned before by your other panelists, China's activities since entering the World Trade Organization, largely at the behest of U.S. presidents, Bill Clinton and then George W. Bush, and that China has been operating in the WTO in a manner outside of what had been expected in Washington and from other WTO leaders, and that the playing field has been unleveled to China's advantage over the last 20 years, and China moving forward between one belt, one road, with the Made in China 2025 policy, which has made many people in the West very uneasy about the very ambitious goals that China has laid out, I think is leading to a growing skepticism that goes beyond just President Trump.
All right. Therefore, I want to invite, even on a bigger picture than just China-U.S. relations, about the trend going on that we see between Washington and some of the other capitals. Now, Mr. Nekrasov, coming from Russia, it's no secret that Russia, even today, is not necessarily on good terms with Washington. That has been a tradition since the beginning of the Cold War. But now you also see, for example, today, as Vice President Pence of the Trump administration suggesting U.S. is establishing this space army It is the first time in 70 years a new branch of U.S. Army that has been established. When he's talking about that, he's talking about it toward so-called threats coming from China, Russia, Iran, and even for the DPRK, or North Korea. Mr. Nekrasov, your Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev today, said if sanctions in the banking system continues on Russia from Washington, Russia is going to consider it as, quote, an economic war. So it seems that these days we are not necessarily very controlled about the phrase war, but with quite a number of evidence actually laying the foundation of that. Mr. Nekrasov, your thought on this?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we are talking about the possibility of the revival of the Cold War. We are actually have entered a situation which is much more dangerous than the Cold War, because during the Cold War, the mutual destruction doctrine basically assured that pragmatism was always the #1 consideration. Nobody raised the stakes too high, understanding that the whole world will be destroyed. Now the situation has completely changed. Now pragmatism has gone out of the window in Western capitals, and in Washington I think nobody can even explain what is going on. Is it a power struggle? Is it a president trying to save his political life by juggling all sorts of things, including foreign policy, and trying to distract attention from himself? It's very difficult to understand what's going on, and that creates instability, and that creates fear, and that creates the possibility of a mistake, which is very dangerous in a nuclear age.
All right.
That is why I think that this is a much more dangerous situation. I think also we must understand the Western economies have been grotesquely mismanaged for the past 30 years. They have built basically a non-existent economy. You know, we have the financial markets that operate completely differently from the proper real economy. And this is a virtual economy. This is a road to self-destruction. And that is why this virtual economy is leading them to the most absurd political policies, you know, foreign policies and military policies. Very dangerous time.
Let's just put, understand your point. Let's just put some of the big words aside. Professor Gary, I understand you have to go in a few minutes. Maybe your final thought before you go, and then I'll go to the other panelists once again. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, you know, my very big picture is that there's been incredible continuity certainly in America's grand strategy for 60 years, 70 years. The strategy has been the U.S., yes, the U.S. helped create an international system, but the U.S. wanted, in essence, to be a benign or a benevolent hegemon. It wanted the system to work, and it focused on win-wins. What the Trump administration is saying is the system hasn't worked for us. We haven't done as well as others. It's now time for us to rebalance that. And it's a changing mindset. The win-win mindset is an economics one, and I think that has been the dominant mode of thinking. The win-loss one is more dangerous, I think, because it's about geopolitics, and it brings into, instead of focusing on cooperation, it talks about competition and conflict. And I think that is a dangerous thing. I just don't know that I would call it a complete reorientation of U.S. strategy yet.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Garrett. And for the other panelists, I want to invite your final thoughts on this grand discussion we are having today. I'm sure that topic will continue for months and probably years. Mr. Citilidis, would you like to go ahead also?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the period of U.S. benign hegemony that the Dean just mentioned since the end of World War II, let's keep in mind that these were institutions that were created in the wake of the defeat of Nazi Germany and Japanese militarism that almost seems ancient by today's leaps and bounds. And what we really have had is a failure in the United States to rethink a global strategy since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the natural rise of China and the resurgent rise of Russia, and we're still adjusting to the rise of these two other great powers. And this is going to be a question we'll be dealing with for many years to come in Washington and in world capitals.
Thank you, sir. And last but not least, for you, Mr. Nekrasov and Mr. Yang, very briefly for both of you, please. Mr. Nekrasov, your final thought.
Well, as I said, the situation has become dangerous, and unfortunately, I think the Western nations don't really have a clear policy of how to move forwards and how to reform their economies, and that is why we will be seeing even more tension, even more problems. And the only thing I see now is happening in a positive way if China and Russia become closer and closer and will be able to somehow stand off and stand against America.
I see.
Because I don't see any other way to balance the world.
I see. That's your thought. Mr. Yang, final word.
Yep. We are at a historical choice between win-win or win-lose. If any of the parties is determined to defeat the other parties, then we will go into strategic confrontation. If we go win-win, then we can avoid the Cold War.
Thank you so much for the three of you, and certainly our earlier speakers as well. Really appreciate it for your thoughts on this important